a friend of all of the work that we do, a man who understands the value of building relationships overseas. And Rick Steves has taken, not only done a lot in terms of helping us. I was just actually recently in Europe and floating around with his book in my hand. And I was in Nice, my wife and we went up to see a Russian Orthodox church he told us about. So I got back and we got up there and it was closed because of a dispute with Putin. I mean, another international incident, right? So anyway, I got up there, and so as I was going through my emails, I realized I had Rick's email. So I shot him a note and said, just an update from Nice, this is what's going on in the church. Hope all's well. And I would get a note back. Glad you're enjoying your trip. Rick Steves from Istanbul. So he's a man on the move. He just told me he spends 5 months on the road preparing all his work. But Rick takes very seriously the role of America in the world, the role of Americans in the world, the role of building community. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Rick Steves, who will be speaking to us this morning. Thank you. Rick?
Thank you, Bill. Thanks very much. It's nice to be able to be with you. I know that you're doing some exciting work. Coming together always inspires people, I think, and I was invited to share my take on how travel can broaden our perspective and why travel's a very constructive thing to do as well. It's just recreational and enjoyable. I've been teaching for 30 years around here. In my first decade of teaching, when I look back on it, it sort of had a progression, kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It starts, you cover your basic stuff, and then you get into more important things. My first decade was teaching people how to travel on a budget. That was the 80s. My book was Europe Through the Back Door. Next decade was appreciating art, history, culture, cuisine, wine, that kind of stuff. And that was, I wrote a book called Europe 101 about history and art for travelers. And in the last decade, I find myself really sort of passionate about talking about travel as a political act. Travel as a way that broadens our perspective, makes us a better citizen of the planet, helps us come back and implement our new, broader global awareness to be, I think, better advocates for people outside of our borders, sort of live our lives in solidarity with people who are struggling. Now, in my work, I talk to a lot of people, and a lot of people are planning their trips, and there's a lot of fear about their travels, and fear has been put on us a lot in the last decade, if you notice. And for me, fear is for people who don't get out very much, and when you do get out, you realize the world's not that scary of a place. It's a beautiful place. And in fact, I think the flip side of fear is understanding, and we gain that through our travel. So my job as a travel writer is not just to find the budget hotels and the good restaurants, but it's to serve the same function, I think, as the jester did back in the Middle Ages. Remember in the Middle Ages, the jester would go out and he'd find out what's going on out there, and he'd actually come back into the court and tell the king the truth, even if it annoyed the king. The king needed that information. The king would actually pay this guy his room and board, and he'd go out there and he could come back. We travelers can serve the same sort of function in our society when we travel. When we come back, we can share the truth, and I think that's a beautiful thing. So I'm just going to review some of the ways that I think travel is a very constructive and valuable thing. And as a travel writer, of course, one thing I need to do is bring home the magic moments for people, and then help them how to have those magic moments on their own. Natural wonders. We got great natural wonders here, but in Europe, you can ride the lift up to the top without even getting sweaty. And then you can have breakfast on a revolving restaurant and then spend the morning walking on that ridge. I mean, tight-roping on a ridge. On one side, you got lakes stretching all the way to Germany. On the other side, you got cut-glass peaks, the Aggermonk and Jungfrau. And ahead of you, you hear the long legato tones of an Alp horn announcing that the helicopter-stocked mountain hut is open. It's just around the corner, and the coffee schnapps is on. Now, that's a beautiful moment. And you can get that in your travels if you know how to travel. Another great thing about travel is it introduces us to different slices of beautiful culture. And a key to being a good traveler is to being comfortable, I think, in our bumpkinness. I don't want to be a sophisticate. I want to be wide-eyed and exploring the world like a little kid. And I'm very comfortable with the fact that I'm a rookie when it comes to appreciating fine cheese. I grew up thinking cheese is orange and the shape of the bread. cheese sandwich. Then you go to Europe and you find these people are evangelical about cheese. I mean, you step into a cheese and it's just a cheese shop and it's a festival of mold. And you'll meet somebody who, I've got a friend in Paris who loves to take me shopping. She takes me into these shops in the morning. She runs a restaurant, so she's figuring out what's going to be on her cheese plate tonight. She picks up this moldy wad of goat cheese, takes a deep whiff and says, "Oh, Rick, smell this cheese. It smells like the feet of angels." The feet of angels, wow. Well, I mean, I don't need to go home and be crazy about cheese, but at least I know somebody else is, and that's kind of fun. History comes alive when you travel. I got a history degree accidentally at the University of Washington because I had traveled. The history classes were just storytelling. It was amazing how fun history was and how meaningful it was because I had had a chance to travel. And we need as travelers to recognize that history is all around us. It's happening today. When we're over there, anywhere in our travels, we can connect with what's going on right now as we live in an exciting time from a historical point of view. I happened to be in Berlin on the opening week of their new parliament building. And this is the Reichstag, which was bombed out in the end of World War II, was on the no man's land, a bombed out hulk on the Berlin Wall for a generation or two. And then just recently, Germany is united. The government goes back to Berlin. They need a new Capitol building in good European style. They don't bulldoze the bombed out one and build a new building. They renovate the historic building and incorporate into that a beautiful bit of modern architecture, this glass dome. Free, designed for German citizens, but tourists are more than welcome to walk that spiral ramp to the very top. Designed with powerful architectural symbolism. It's designed so German citizens can literally look down over the shoulders of their legislators as they're doing their work. They've been jerked around by their legislators too much in the last century, and they're going to keep an eye on them this time. It's a very cool notion. And I was up there surrounded by teary-eyed Germans. Now, anytime you're surrounded by teary-eyed Germans, something really exceptional is going on. And it occurred to me, wow, this is a very important moment for these German people. Many of those teary eyes old enough to remember their city bombed flat, just a bunch of rubble after World War II. Now they had a great new city and a great new parliament building. No more division, no more communism, no more capital, no more fascism. They were a united country with a new Capitol building looking into a promising future. Wow, it was cool. I was kind of moved by it. And then I looked around and I saw other Americans didn't have a clue. They were completely oblivious to the excitement of that moment. They were just dumbed down. And it saddened me. I thought, I'm living in a dumbed down society. And the more I think about it, the more I find that there are powerful forces in our society that would find it convenient if we were all just dumbed down. Just go shopping. Red flags should go up when people tell you to just go shopping. They should go up like all over the place. And I vowed then and there in my own little world as a travel writer to, even if it's more profitable to be dealing with a dumbed down clientele, I would work to smart them up. I'm so thankful I get to work in public broadcasting where you can assume an attention span and respect the intellect of your audience. I'm almost going into a pledge drive now. But as a TV producer, as a guidebook writer, as a tour producer, as a travel writer, I want to expect my travelers to be engaged. And I think that's not too much to ask for people like all of you who care about this world and who are great citizens of this planet, to expect our neighbors to be engaged. Don't put up with dumbed downness. We are smart enough to get our brains around what's going on, and we can do better. One great thing about travel is you meet a lot of people. You meet people you wouldn't normally meet at home. I think I meet more different people in a month in Europe than I do in the rest of the year here in the United States, and I love that. Doesn't need to be earth-shaking encounters. I mean, I was in Italy recently, and this little kid was just staring at me. Finally, his dad said, "Excuse my son, he stares at Americans." I said, "Well, what's with that?" He said, "Well, last week at McDonald's, we were having our hamburger," and he said, "Dad, why do Americans have this fluffy white bread?" And he said, "Because Americans have no teeth." The kid was confused. He stared at me to see if I had teeth. I showed him my teeth. I straightened out that little bit of international misunderstanding. There's so many silly misconceptions that we have between nations, and when we travel, we humanize each other, we get beyond the propaganda, and we learn who we are. It's a beautiful thing. One of my favorite places to travel is Ireland, because when I'm in Ireland, I'm enjoying this sensation of understanding a foreign language. I don't know what it's like to understand a foreign language, but when you talk to Irish people, they think in a Gaelic template, and they've got this wonderful brogue and this wonderful gift of gab, and it's just a delight. And if you want Ireland in the extreme, you go to the west coast where they have those Gaeltachts, those national parks for the traditional cultures, where the government is actually subsidizing the survival of traditional ways of life, helping small farms and that sort of thing. And you hang out with people who speak Gaelic first and English second. And they are great conversationalists. Got in a talk with this guy, and the guy on the left, after a while, I said, "Were you born here?" And he said, "No, it was about 5 miles down the road." Later on, I asked him, "Have you lived here all your life?" And he said, "Not yet." It's just charming. It'll ruin your momentum. You'll toss your itinerary out the window and be meeting people. When I'm making a guidebook, when I'm doing a tour, when I'm making a TV show, if I'm not connecting people with people, the experience is going to be flat, and I'm getting pretty stressed out in my work. I know it's going to be a lousy TV show, tour, or book if I'm not connecting people with people. If your trip's not sparkling, you're not meeting enough people. People is what carbonates your travel experience, and that's the mark of a good traveler. Now, my beat is Europe, and I've written 30 guidebooks on Europe. I employ 80 people in Edmonds, just a little ways away from here, and we all are just working really hard to organize our information to help Americans travel smartly, thinking of Europe as the wading pool for world exploration. The big news in Europe is the unification of Europe. A few years ago, basically all of Europe united, or since World War II, basically, Europe has slowly, in a stuttering kind of way, been working towards unity. And what they're doing is creating a free trade zone of 500 million people to compete with or 400 million people to compete with a free trade zone of 300 million people in the United States of America. Each of us have about the same economies, $13 or $14 trillion, to put things into perspective. When you go to Europe, you will find that people work hard, but they also play hard. It's a different kind of lifestyle in Europe, and they're sort of getting a reality check right now and realizing they can't play quite so hard. They've got to work a little longer before they retire and so on. But when you go to Europe today, this was in the Netherlands. It was a Wednesday afternoon. These are grown adults here. It's a work day. I ask them, "What's going on?" "Well, it's Wednesday afternoon. We get together and play, Sure, they work hard, but they play hard also. I've got a friend here in Seattle who's running an organization called Take Back Your Time. It's a very small movement, and the idea is to remind American workers that we have the shortest vacations in the rich world. And we are just mindlessly working ourselves into an early grave. For what? His national holiday is October 23rd, because by his estimate, if you were a European working as hard as we Americans do, October 23rd would be the last day you'd need to go to work for the year. And that's just sort of the standard in Europe, which would be unthinkable on a campus like this, So it's not right or wrong, but there's a different sort of life value or ethic in Europe. Now, there's a lot of demonstrations on the streets of our country, this Take Back Wall Street or Occupy Wall Street, and you're certainly going to see a lot of demonstrations in Europe. My take on this is in the last decade or so, we have all conned ourselves into thinking we're wealthier than we are. And now people are telling us there's not enough money to sustain. You cannot consume more than you produce endlessly. And if you're making your living just rearranging the furniture on top and trying to live well, it's just not going to work in the future. I think in Europe, they've got a worse situation than us because all of these unsustainable entitlements are based on the thought that there are a lot of young people working. Europe has it different than us. They're a more geriatric continent than us, and they're a more generous continent in entitlements and worker rights than us. It was sustainable back when there were a lot of young people working, a few people retiring, and they don't live very long. That could go on forever like that. Now, because Europe is so successful and prosperous, there's fewer people working, fewer young people, more old people retiring, and they live a long time, living the same equation and promise when the pyramid was the other way. And it's very difficult politically to tell people who've lived their whole life and worked their whole life on a certain promise to say, actually, things are different now and you can't have it the way we said you can have it. Your parents had it that way, but you got to work longer and you're going to get less after you're done working. That's enough to get people out on the streets. In Greece last year, they told workers suddenly, overnight, retirement age was going to go from 59 to 67. So you and your buddy are working in the same company all your life. One of you is 1 month older than the other one. There's a cutoff like that. He got to retire when he was 59. You got to work till you're 67. That's enough to get you out in the streets. Now, generally, Europeans love to get out and march. That's a European thing to do, a manifestation. I think it's a celebration. I feel good when I see a European demonstration, because that's part of the fabric of their democracy. Here in the United States, that's generally just too much exercise, you know. And we are inclined to go home, find a TV station that affirms our frustrations and our fears, and shake our fists. As a matter of fact, I was just talking to a man who works for CNN when I was in Turkey last couple weeks, and he told me CNN, and I don't know exactly how this shakes out, but according to him, CNN has just gone to be unapologetically sort of liberal in its coverage here in the United States, along with MSNBC, while Fox and other networks would be conservative. And he said CNN is still straight news outside of our country. But in the United States, the only way for a news organization, as far as he could understand it, to survive is to be catering to people's what they want to hear, to make conservatives feel good, to make liberals feel good, because they are not primarily or fundamentally news agencies anymore. They are wings of entertainment organizations owned by entertainment corporations, and the news has to make money or they'll replace it with some reality show or something like that. And the only way for them to be profitable in this sort of environment is to have a bias, liberal or conservative. Again, that leads me into another public broadcasting pledge thing, is that news may be boring, but it doesn't have to sell ads. Therefore, it can be a little more straight. But it is a radical change in the whole environment for making news. When you're owned by entertainment, you have to be entertaining, you have to sell ads, and that means they've learned they've got to have a bias. Well, I was traveling in Central America back in the Civil Wars down there in the 80s and 90s, and everybody who wanted to know what was going on knew you had to buy the left-wing press and the right-wing press, read them both, and synthesize it with your own sort of life experience, and maybe that's going to be a reality for us. Point is, there's going to be a lot of demonstrations in Europe. You're going to see a lot of coverage of that on the news. It's going to look kind of like the sky is falling, but it's not. In Athens, the demonstrators just go in front of the Parliament building there in Syntagma Square, and they turn over some cars and burn a Starbucks and get on the news. It's a good afternoon out for those anarchists that live just a few blocks away. That's going to be happening a lot in Europe. The big news in Europe is the move to the east. A few years ago, nearly the entire Warsaw Pact country joined the EU. Overnight, there's 100 million new capitalists, and overnight, the geographical center of Europe shifts from Belgium to the Czech Republic. Now, when you go to Eastern Europe today, it just feels full of energy. It's like a festival of pent-up entrepreneurial spirit. This shot is in Poland, and it reminds me of the bleak days long before this in Poland, when it was so demoralizing and discouraging. I remember on earlier trips to Poland back in the Cold War, people would actually take their windshield wipers in with them at night because they had the stupid command economy where somebody forgot to order windshield wipers. There's not enough of them to meet the demand. Thieves would get wind of that. They'd steal your windshield wipers and sell them for a fortune in the black market. That's kind of what happens when you have a society that ignores the laws of supply and demand. Well, today, of course, in all over Eastern Europe, the laws of the supply and demand are kicking in. There's plenty of windshield wipers, and people are leaving them on at night. So it's a big change in Eastern Europe. When you travel around Europe, one of the charming things, I think, is the cultural diversity you find. When we think about Europe uniting, you might think, well, I love Europe, but what I love about Europe is its diversity. And as it's uniting, is it going to be one big uniform strip mall, very efficient, and everybody speaking the same language and having the same coins? No. Counterintuitively, Europe is becoming more diverse as it unites because there's three sort of loyalties: region, nation, and Europe. In our lifetimes, most of the headlines have been made by regions threatening nations. As Europe unites, nations are less of a player, and regions do not threaten Europe. Okay? So when you think about Basque people trying to break away from Madrid, or Celtic people in Brittany trying to break away from Paris, or Scottish people or Irish people bugging London, well, that doesn't happen so much anymore because you can secede from Spain, but you cannot secede from Europe. And power is coming out of Brussels more and more. And Brussels favors the ethnic regions. Clearly, Brussels wants the ethnic regions to do well as opposed to the false political boundaries of modern states. When you go to a city hall anywhere in Europe, you'll see three flags. One's for the region, one's for the country, and one's for Europe. If you ask somebody in Munich, where are you from? They might say Bavaria, they might say Germany, or they might say Europe. For the first time since 1707, Scotland has a parliament building in Scotland instead of London. Why? London's not threatened. Back in Franco's time, if you danced the sacred Sardana dance, sacred to the Catalonian people outside of the cathedral in Barcelona after Mass on Sunday, they'd arrest you. Now, of course, people can dance to the Sardana dance. People are teaching their children Catalonian first and Spanish second. And you can wave your Catalonian flag. In the old days, you had to wave the soccer team flag to show your patriotism without having any personal risk. If you go to a Subway sandwich shop in Madrid or Barcelona, you're very likely to see the menu in 4 languages. Here we are in Barcelona. This would be an ATM machine. You know the buttons for the languages. On the upper right, upper left, I mean, you see Catalan, which is for the Catalan people, and then Espanol. Gallego would be for the people of northwest Spain, a Celtic language, and Euskara would be Basque. So 4 different languages in Spain. It's a fascinating mix, and it's more thriving and vibrant and alive now than it was a generation ago. And then you have German, French, English, and everybody else. Now, if you went to Basque country, you'd have Euskara up there in the top, and you'd certainly have Catalan up in the top 4. Not because Catalonian people need the Catalan language to use an ATM machine in Basque country. They could speak English or Spanish, but out of solidarity. It just makes sense. You want to give your fellow victims of the tyranny of the majority the same sort of solidarity and support that you'd want them to give you. This man is named Armin Walsh. He is the Indiana Jones of Tyrolean archaeologists. And he just loves to excavate old medieval castles and turn them into museums. And when he wants money there in the Tyrol, he doesn't go to Vienna. He goes to Brussels. And he doesn't go to Brussels and say, I got a great idea for Austria. He goes to Brussels and says, I've got a great idea for the Tyrol. Brussels would give him no money for Austria, because Austria is not an ethnic true area. It's a line drawn after a war, you know. But the Tyrol is an ethnic region that ignores those political boundaries. It's part in Italy and part in Austria. And he'll come home with money from Brussels. All over Europe, you've got sort of an internal investment, almost like an internal Marshall Plan going on. And of course, there's economic chaos right now, and I don't know how that's all going to shake out. But generally, it's an interesting situation where you got all the nations in the family of European nations who are joining the EU, and every nation is either a net giver or a net receiver, depending on how their average wealth is compared to the European average. If you're richer than the average, like Germany or France, you'll give more than you get to the European Union. If you're poorer, like Portugal, Greece, or Ireland, you will receive more than you get. When I was first traveling, Portugal, Greece, and Ireland, the famous poor countries of the European Union, had no freeways. Now they're laced with freeways, and when you see a new freeway, like this one in Ireland, it'll have a European flag on it. It says, this project has received 85% financial aid from the European Union. That means France and Germany. Now get on board, we're competing with the United States. Europe invests in its infrastructure, recognizing its weakest links to bring that whole European Union up so it can compete well with other economic powers. It is no coincidence that the countries that are needing bailouts now and having all this crisis now, Portugal, Greece, and Ireland, are the ones that were the poorest before, and their currencies were tied to the euro. And I believe, I'm not an economist, but it just seems logical that if their currency becomes the euro, you can't devalue the currency wholesale to diminish the return people get on their labor, even if they're not producing as much. So they are falsely brought up with the Germans, and their economy is fundamentally untrue. And today it's rotting out and needs to be bailed out. There's some interesting soul searching going on with who should actually be in the euro. But it's certainly a powerhouse, and there's a lot of investment going on in the infrastructure. Last time I was in Greece, I came upon this bridge. I had been crossing the Gulf of Corinth all my life with a little funky ferry, and suddenly there's a big fancy bridge. This is not a Greek bridge. This is a German bridge built in Greece to get German trucks filled with gummy bears down to the Peloponnesian Peninsula. It's just common sense. Germany needs to be able to get its stuff down to the Peloponnesian Peninsula. It makes sense for them to build that bridge, and they do. Europeans are investing in their infrastructure like we can hardly imagine. This is the new train station in Berlin. Recently, I was in Munich taking pictures of trains coming into the station, specifically cute little birds squished onto the windshields of those trains. And when I saw that little bird squished onto the windshield of that train, I thought, well, first I thought, you'd wait all your life to see a bird squished under the windshield of a train where I live. It's just surrealistic. Birds don't get squished under windshields of trains here. And then I thought, in Europe, they're really making all sorts of impressive bullet-like trains. In your travels, you will encounter a fair amount of anti-Americanism. Even with Obama as president, you'll find anti-American graffiti and so on. And when you see it, it is not anti-you or anti-me or American individual. It is my experience is anti-American trade policy and anti-American militarism. And it's tough for a lot of Americans to deal with this. I've been promoting travel and tours and so on for 30 years, and we've gone through all sorts of up and downs from a goodwill and a terrorism point of view and all that kind of thing. And people are just routinely upset with American trade policy and wars. It doesn't really matter what I think, but as travelers and as Americans, we should be aware and respect what other 96% of humanity thinks. When the other 96% of humanity looks at our country, they see 4% of this planet spending as much on our military as everybody else put together. We have doubled our military spending since 9/11. We don't even have a credible enemy, and we've doubled it. And even in the toughest time, when we're compromising everything that we care about in our society, the one sacred cow is our military. Even now, have you noticed that the super committee is getting second thoughts on having that trigger thing which actually hits military? You can't cut military. Why the hell not? We're spending as much as everybody else put together. I mean, it's incredible what we're spending on our military and how we have got military sort of commitments in 140 different countries on this planet, how our embassies are routinely the most fortified building in entire countries. I've seen it. It's scary. How only the United States can declare somebody's natural resources on the other side of this planet vital to our, quote, national security interests. Those people who are sitting on those resources would at least like us to be candid enough to say vital to our custom material lifestyle. But no, we write it off as our national security interests. This, maybe you and your neighbors and I can be comfortable with this and rationalize it. We're the world's policemen, we're the great whatever. But from the other 96% of humanity's point of view, it can piss them off, It just frustrates them. I mean, we are routinely outvoted in the United Nations 140 to 4 when it comes to issues that matter to desperately poor people. 140 to 4 for child labor laws, for landmines, for water issues, for debt reduction for desperately poor countries. Who stands with us? Israel, Marshall Islands, and Micronesia. That's the coalition of the enlightened, compassionate ones. And everybody else just doesn't get it, apparently, I mean, I try to be really credible in these talks because there's a lot of amazing things you can say. And I go to the UN website, and it's still happening. We're still being outvoted like that. It's just very, very difficult situation. And we got to realize that a lot of people are going to look at us like an empire. It's one hot button thing. Whenever I'm writing in my blog or Facebook or whatever, and I mention that we might be acting like an empire, just people get up in arms. They don't want to be an empire. We are how you are perceived. And there's never been an empire or a power perceived as an empire that didn't have angry people on its borders nipping at it. Romans had barbarians, Habsburgs had anarchists, we have terrorists. It's just it goes with the territory. From an individual travel point of view, you don't need to accessorize this way. I've never found I need to hide the fact that I'm American. People love to talk to Americans, and if you want to be political, they love to get into discussions. But you certainly don't need to pretend you're Canadian, even in France. I've taken 1,000 people here to France for the last 30 years. French love American individuals. They just don't want to get lectures from us on how they should live. When I go to France these days, I'm always impressed by how the French really want to be our friends. I was at a chateau recently filming, and the mom and pop, whose aristocratic family had run that chateau for generations, said, "We have an American film crew. We must have a little party." We had wine and cheese, and they brought out this precious 48-star American flag, the one they hoisted over their village on that great day in 1944 when they were liberated from Nazi tyranny by American troops. And they said, "We will forever be thankful for the strength and the valor and the compassion of the United States of America in our difficult time." But that doesn't mean 60 years later they're going to follow us into wars of our choice. You see, that's where the disconnect is. And as Americans, I think we need to respect that. Terrorism has always been there, and it always will be there. And the big guys are going to be targeted, and that means us. I think it's important when we're traveling to keep the terrorist risk in perspective. What is the risk of terrorism? 12 million Americans go to Europe every year, 12 million come back. There is essentially no risk of terrorism when you are an individual traveler. It's important to recognize that. And if you hate terrorism as much as I do, you know that the most powerful thing we can do is to travel a lot, come home and help our country fit better into this ever smaller planet. I'm running out of time here. I'm sorry about that, but so I'm just going to kind of speed it up. I can't talk faster, but I will talk a little bit briefer for each slide. It's so fun when you travel to realize that every country has its own 4th of July. I mean, it seems kind of elementary, but I didn't realize that until I was an adult, that, you know, August 1st is a great time to be in Switzerland. Also, everybody has their own dream. I grew up thinking the world is a pyramid with us on top and everybody else trying to get there. And then I realized, no, they got the Bulgarian dream or the Moroccan dream or the Norwegian dream. And these people have the Sri Lankan dream. And that's a beautiful thing. Also, people have struggles. People have heroic struggles that we're pretty much clueless about. And when you travel, you gain an appreciation for that, I think. Every year, 6 or 8 languages go extinct. And they don't always do it politely. It's this long, difficult struggle for the little nationalities. And it's a stirring thing that's happening all over this planet. I was raised thinking Ethan Allen, Patrick Henry, Nathan Hale, those guys were like the ultimate. And now I realize they were great, but they're kind of a dime a dozen on this planet. Every country has their own Nathan Hales. And it's fun when you're traveling to find a contemporary Nathan Hale and then get into it, empathize with that local appreciation. Like if you go to Central America, Archbishop Oscar Romero, you learn a little bit about Archbishop Oscar Romero, and all of a sudden your experience in El Salvador is much, much different. This guy was the charismatic champion of the poor when they had a revolution to try to get some land rights and so on. He said, I'll be killed, but I'll rise again in my people. Certainly he was killed. They lost his revolution, their revolution, and he lives today in El Salvador like you cannot imagine. I had the opportunity to go to Mazatlan and lay on the beach, and I was ready for a vacation. And then at that same time, some friends invited me to go down to El Salvador for the 25th anniversary of the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero. Told my family, I'm not going to be any fun on the beach in Mazatlan. I got to go to El Salvador. I was in a sweaty bunk dorm. I was covered with bug bites, eating rice and beans one day and beans and rice the next. And I was having the greatest travel experience you could imagine. Marching with tens of thousands of people through the streets of San Salvador, standing by these people who are on the receiving end of globalization. It's not an easy issue. It's not right or wrong necessarily, but it is important for we Americans, I think, to, in our travels, gain an empathy for people who are really struggling. We came upon a monument in San Salvador. It looks a lot like the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. It's a perfect knockoff of that memorial. It's got just as many names chipped into that granite. And each one of these names is somebody that died fighting you and me. Now, maybe they were communists and they needed to be killed, but they still are loved ones who are gone because of our trade policy, basically. It's a complicated, ugly, messy reality. And when we travel, I like to grapple with it. Recently, I went to Iran. People said, why did you go to Iran? And I just thought about it. I thought, well, you know, I'm going there because I think it makes sense to know people before you bomb them. It should hurt when you kill people. Sometimes you have to kill people, but we should go there and not just dehumanize them. There's 70 million Iranians. What makes them tick? What makes them vote for Ahmadinejad? What is their cultural baggage? Went there, and it's kind of a challenging experience. Iran's a booming place. It's got 12 million people in the capital city of Tehran, 12 million, and you're surrounded by 10-story tall banners that say down with the USA, flags made by dropping bombs and skulls instead of stars and stripes. It's kind of hateful. But then you're down in the traffic, and you get a little more different sense of what it's like. I was stuck in a traffic jam just below this building, and I was silent, and suddenly the driver just burst out, "Death to traffic." And I thought, wait a minute, I thought it was death to America or death to Israel. And I said, right now it's death to traffic. And I said, what's with that? And he said, well, here in Iran, when something's frustrating us and when it's out of our control, we say death to that. And I thought, well, that sounds like damn. And then it occurred to me, they don't speak English, they speak Farsi, and they're translating it literally, and that's damn America, death to America. And then I thought, have I ever thought damn somebody? Damn those teenagers. I have, as a matter of fact. Do I want them to die and burn in hell for an eternity? No, it's just after midnight. Turn down the music. Damn those teenagers. So not to excuse their bad language, but I mean, it behooves us to be a little more sophisticated, as so many saber rattlers are trying to dumb everything down and stick it on a bumper sticker, that we understand it's a little more complicated than what we might be led to believe on 24/7 news coverage. And when you go to Iran, you realize they've got baggage just like we've got 9/11 baggage. Think of our baggage from 9/11. We lost 3,000 people, and we're forever changed. Iran lost 100,000 people in recent history. Invaded from Iraq. Saddam Hussein, with American funding, invaded them, and they lost 100,000 people. That's their baggage. They got 1/4 of our population. So it's about 100 times more the pain that they've experienced than we experienced in per capita than we experienced in 9/11, and that's baggage. And when you go to the cemeteries, every town, Issaquah, Mukilteo, La Conner, Bellingham, has a vast martyrs cemetery. And when you go there, you find widows who go every week and weep on the tomb of their loved one who was killed, fighting American-supported Saddam Hussein. She's probably not very sophisticated from a receiver of propaganda point of view, and I bet she's pretty mad at the United States. This is baggage. This is real stuff that I think we need to deal with. And I went to Iran, thankfully, with public television, able to make a TV show, Bring It Home and air it. If you haven't had a chance to see it, you can watch it on Hulu anytime. Just go to Hulu and look for Rick Steves and Iran. I'll be handing out some free stuff later on when I'm done with my talk, but this 60-page Iran journal is part of what I'd love you to have if you want to read my experiences there. But I was on the street, and an example of how impressive these people are. I was just standing there in the street. A woman comes across the street, a well-dressed professional woman. She says, "Are you an American journalist?" I said, "Yeah." She kind of did this on my chest and said, "I want you to go home and tell the truth. We're united, we're strong, and we just don't want our little girls to be raised like Britney Spears." Well, neither do we. She was scared to death that if America changed her government and put a Shah back on the throne so we could get their oil, that her girl would become a boy toy, a drug addict, and a crass materialist. And she's got some values that are like pretty strong, and she didn't want that. And back when the Shah was in power, they were bragging the miniskirts were shorter in Tehran than they were in Paris. So it's a very powerful, interesting thing, and we need to know more about Iran than we learned from Ted Koppel on Nightline with the hostage crisis. So this is some of the value of travel. Okay, I'm just going to zip through these last things, and I'll be done at 9:30. Is that all right? I love it when people are excited about liberty. Some places they have 2 arms worth of liberty, you know? And it can be just cheery stuff. In this town in Italy, the older kids every year at an annual festival teach the younger kids how to make a good ravioli. Here's a town in France whose Chamber of Commerce thinks it's worth investing in making orbs where people can develop a good nose to appreciate the fine differences between the wines that they produce. All over Europe, people pay too much for a loaf of bread in order to buy it from the person who baked it. And that's just part of their ethic. Wouldn't make no sense here in the United States, where we have to go for economy and scale. But in Europe, they've got a different mindset about that. Europeans love their fine wine, and they know how to fill it up cheap. I'm fascinated by how Americans are really determined to legislate morality. Everybody in this room's got morals, and I bet everybody's morals are a little different than everybody else's. And if one person was in power and said, "This is the way it is morally," and they were able to implement that legally, that would be pretty dangerous. And to a certain degree, we're trying to do that in the United States. My European friends tell me, and they live with a much more diverse and compact and dense population, they tell me a society has to make a choice: tolerate alternative lifestyles or build more prisons. And then they always follow up by reminding me how we Americans incarcerate far more people than any of our friends outside of our country. Prostitution is a good example. Nobody thinks prostitution is good, but it's going to happen. You can make it a crime, or you can make it a education and a health challenge. You can deal with it with moralizing, or you can deal with it with harm reduction. Europeans are really into harm reduction. In many cases, prostitution is legal, it's unionized. Prostitutes have to get a medical checkup before they can get their license, so they're not spreading diseases. And the whole idea is when she gets in trouble and she pushes her emergency button, she gets a pimp does not come, but a policeman comes to bail her out. It doesn't always work quite that way, but that is the ideal, and that's a very classic European harm reduction approach to it. I was at a Starbucks in Switzerland recently, went downstairs to the bathroom, and everything was blue. Now, what was this? What's with this? And then I realized, oh yeah, blue lights. I cannot see my veins. Couldn't shoot up if I wanted to. They got a lot of junkies out on the streets there, and they don't want them shooting up in their bathrooms. So you put blue lights in there, and junkies realize I won't go there to get my fix. Across the street is a machine that used to sell cigarettes. Now it's been retooled. It sells government-subsidized syringes. Far too racy for our country to have government-subsidized syringes on the sale in the streets. But in Switzerland, nobody passes diseases by sharing needles. It's a very effective program. And down the street from here is a government-subsidized little place called a Cafe Fix, a heroin maintenance clinic, where junkies go to get medical counseling, job counseling, help themselves get their lives back on track. It's an amazing, different approach to a problem we have on both sides of the Atlantic. Last year in the United States, we lost 18,000 people to heroin overdoses. In Europe, they lost less than half of that, and they got more people. A lot of my tourists, when I'm taking my groups to Europe, go, what are all these junkies on the street, all these liberal Europeans? Look how many drug addicts they have. No, theirs are just still alive and not in prison. It's a different thing, and we need to understand that. I've been real busy lately in drug policy discussions in our society. For 10 years, I've been on the board of NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. I'm co-sponsoring a bill, I-502, in our state that very well could be the first bill in the United States that legalizes, taxes, and regulates marijuana. It's not a pro-drugs thing at all. It's a practical harm reduction measure to get rid of a bad law that's causing more harm to our society than the very drug it's trying to protect us from. So many parallels to alcohol prohibition with marijuana prohibition. If you're curious about this, you can learn more about it. I inject a European sensibility to the discussion here. And the people I'm working with, like the city attorney in Seattle and the prosecutor, John McKay, former prosecuting attorney, and lots of professors and legislators and ACLU people, realize that drug use will not go up markedly if we legalize it. It'll just take the crime and the money and the violence out of it. A lot of Americans think there's a whole reservoir of people that would love to ruin their lives with drugs if only it was legal. In 25 years in the Netherlands, they've not arrested a person for smoking a joint, and use does not go up. As a matter of fact, the average Dutch citizen consumes half the marijuana that the average American does by every measure. It's counterintuitive, but the hard laws have nothing to do with consumption. Portuguese legalized the consumption of all drugs 10 years ago. And they've assessed that law, and they're happy with it. A lot of people say marijuana is a gateway drug. Well, the only thing that the Europeans have learned that's gateway about marijuana is its illegality, because when it's illegal, in order to get it, you got to buy it from a criminal on the street who's got a vested interest in selling you something more profitable and more addictive. So it's a fascinating area. You'll be hearing more about it this next year. But this is something you can learn when you travel. Whatever you're interested in, you can pick up on. It's fun when you go to Europe, which is my sort of test grounds, to analyze the difference between Europeans and Americans. We're both well-educated, affluent, Christian societies. We're both passionate about government by, for, and of the people. When I think about it, we are passionate about government by, for, and of the people via the corporations that we own. It's not a good or bad thing. It's just we want to create an environment where our corporations can thrive. In Europe, it's more government by, for, and of the people in spite of the corporations that they own, where the government is actually safeguarding the environment, the future, and losers in the capitalist game from the excesses of corporate action and so on. And we're going to see right now things coming to a head as we have government by, for, and of the people via the corporations we own. But when we go to Europe, we find it's a little bit different sort of sensibility. If you want to analyze it and look at Europe in the extreme, you go to Scandinavia. That's the least church-going, most affluent, most content, most socialistic part of Europe with the highest taxes. And instead of a church on the main square, they've got a city hall on the main square. Stockholm and Oslo, for example, it's got a big, gathering place instead of a nave, but a gathering place. Instead of a pulpit, you've got a lectern. Instead of mosaics celebrating Bible stories on the front wall, you've got mosaics celebrating heroic individuals who have contributed mightily to their society. I love to talk to my European friends about this or that issue, and I use them as a soundboard. This is Ollie, who's a school teacher in Switzerland. And I just asked him recently, how can you Swiss people so docilely pay such high taxes? And without missing a beat, he said, well, what's it worth to live in a country where there's no homelessness, no hunger, and where everybody, regardless of the affluence of their parents, has access to quality health care and education? He's not a crusader. He's not a liberal. That's just a European sensibility. It's a fascinating thing to look at. In my travels, it's occurred to me that we are really loving and caring people here in the United States. But one thing we're not very good at is grappling with the gap between rich and poor. And we've got it here in our own country, and of course there's a growing gap between the rich world and the poor world. For 30 years, I've had the poor world reaching in my window in my travels. And you know it's there when you travel, if you make a point not to isolate yourself from it. I choose to travel to places where I will have to be confronted by that. Last Christmas, I was in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Mexico City, just to see what it was like down there. And I noticed that any middle-class neighborhood in any of those countries has to pool their money to have an armed guard on the corner. It's not a pretty picture. And what I've learned is even if you're motivated only by greed, if you know what's good for you, you don't want to be filthy rich in a desperately poor world. It's just not a pretty picture. And when you travel, of course, you realize the beautiful humanity of it all. The fact that these little kids are just as deserving and precious as our little kids. And while my little girl's got plenty of money for straight teeth and money left over for a whitener, these kids don't even have running water in their town. They don't even have moms, because the moms have to spend 5 hours a day walking for water. Now, my kid gets straight teeth and whitener, and I noticed every kid in her class gets straight teeth and whitener. It's not a guilt trip. We live in a winning system. We work hard. Our kids get straight teeth. But this is an opportunity to recognize that for the cost of 2 sets of braces, you could drill a well in a thirsty little town. And then those moms could stay home and raise their kids instead of abandoning them to walk for water more and more every year. And if all you're worried about is national security, like so many Americans, you can make a very strong case. And it's a tough case to make these days in Washington, D.C., because nobody profits off of this at home like they do when you sell arms. But you can make a very strong case that by drilling that well, you're doing more for American security than by building a bomb. Because every time those people in that village walk across the street instead of across the county for water, when they pump that water, they'll be thinking, God bless America. My kid gets water. I can stay home and love my children like I want to. It's a beautiful, powerful thing. It's an opportunity. We have some important challenges facing us these days. And I'll tell you, when you travel, your worldview has changed. Everybody's got a different worldview determined by their life story. And those of us who have traveled a lot know that travel broadens our perspective. It's nothing new. 1,500 years ago, Muhammad said, don't tell me how educated you are, tell me how much you've traveled. Thomas Jefferson said, travel makes a person wiser, if less happy. Mark Twain traveled, and he wrote famously that travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness. And I've traveled, and I know that it is just a wonderful way to gain an empathy for people outside of our borders. And when I come home, and when I step into the privacy of the voting booth, I have that almost perverse passion for voting, not for what's good for me, but what's good for people who are struggling. And I think in the long run, that's good for me too. Thank you very much. Thank you. You know, if I could just take a sec, Bill, I brought some, I shipped some little freebies all the way from Edmonds here, and I've got them stacked out there, and I don't want to take them home. So if you are interested in any of this stuff, it's entirely free, and then when you leave, it's immediately on the right. There's a little counter spread out against the wall. There's the journal I did about our Iran trip. And it's just a fun little insight if you're curious about all that Britney Spears stuff. There's lots of other anecdotes I could share that just are mind-blowing. Pick this up. Again, if you want to see the show, it airs occasionally on Channel 9, but you can watch it immediately at Hulu. I've also been working hard to avail our material to teachers who want to give their students a broader perspective and celebrate the planet and not be afraid of it and so on. And it's called Rick Steves for Teachers. And this is just a chapter that I excerpted from one of my books. And it is a chapter from the Travel as a Political Act book about the European Union and how it can challenge us. And I just have a bunch of extras of these, so I put them out there. If you want to grab that, you're welcome to. The only way I make serious money is by taking people on tours. We take 10,000 people on tours every year. We took 400 groups last year. And more than half the people who take our tours are people who come back for more. And this is the brochure that we explain our tours. We've got 35 different itineraries. There's a DVD in here that gives you a good rundown on the tour program. And then I collaborated with the Smithsonian Institute last year, or the Smithsonian Magazine people, and they wanted me to write an entire edition. I thought, that sounds like a lot of work. And then we talked about it, and I thought, well, actually, it sounds like fun. So this is 20 articles on my favorite 20 places in Europe. And I just assumed I would be doing the photographs too. And they said, no, Rick, we'll take care of the art. And I'm glad they said that, because I've never seen my favorite articles paired with really classy art. This thing sold out all over the United States. I liked it so much I bought 50,000 extra copies, and I just give them away whenever I give a talk to people like you. So if you want to grab that, that would be cool. My friend David Beckman runs Bread for the World, and I've been a supporter of them ever since I was a student. Bread for the World is a lobby organization in Washington, D.C. that is doing a very difficult task right now of trying to protect homeless and hungry people in our society and across the seas from draconian budget cuts in what I consider a false affluence that's being put in our society. It's a difficult struggle. It's a kind of a thankless task for a lot of people. They're up against all sorts of lobbyists that are well paid and armed for just enriching already rich parts of our society. I'm doing what I can to help Bread for the World empower them. If my talk now struck you as interesting and you'd like to read more about it, it came right out of this Travel as a Political Act book. This was named the Travel Book of the Year in the United States last year by the Society of American Travel Writers. I'm proud of that because I'm so thankful that the mainstream travel writing business is recognizing this new approach to travel, that it is really important that we broaden our perspectives rather than our waist belt through travel, okay? And if you'd like to get this book, I have donated 50 copies for free if you will give $20 to Bread for the World, okay? When you leave here, it's at the end of the hall down there, and I'll be over there afterwards to sign the books. But if we don't sell them here, I'm just going to take them back, and that's a lost opportunity for Bread for the World. You'd pay about $20 for the book in the stores. If you'd like one, again, it's kind of like my challenge to you. If you'd like to support Bread for the World, every penny will go. You can write a check to Bread for the World or give a $20 bill and grab one of these books. Any questions about any of that? Good, okay, Bill. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Rick.